Welcome to the Mad and Crib Theology Podcast. It's so nice to be here with you today, and we're excited that it's finally spring. At least I am. I saw some tulips coming up in my garden yesterday, so that made me very happy. Before we get started today speaking to our guests, Beth Anne and Laura, we just have a couple of announcements that we wanted to mention. Um, we are still looking for pieces for our anthology that the Mad and Crip Theology Press is putting together called Growing Up Female and Evangelical: Madness, Faith, and the Search for Community. So if that resonates with you, or you know anyone in your family or friend group who might be interested in writing something or creating something for the anthology, um, the deadline's the end of April. So we'd really appreciate you submitting something. You can check us out on Mad and Crip, theologypress.ca, or follow us on Instagram at Mad and Crip, and you'll be able to see some information about that. Um, Also, we have a call for content out for the Canadian Journal of Theology and Mental Health and Disability for this fall. It's just like a general call. So if you have papers kicking around or poems, art, stories that you feel like you're ready to get out in the world, we'd love for you to submit. And as well, a fun thing, the Mad and Crypt Theology Press has some new t-shirts up on our website. So if you're interested in repping the press that way and getting some cool new t-shirts into your spring wardrobe, you can check those out. And it's the first time that we've ever had our t-shirts in stock. So I'm excited to start mailing those out to folks. Yeah, so those are our announcements for today.
I think, Emily, to begin, we will invite you both to introduce yourself and your book. And for Beth Ann, we are going to show your collage. So for people who are watching on YouTube, you can they can see and you can kind of describe it for people listening.
Sounds good.
So why don't you start us off,
Sure.
Bethany?
Hi, I'm Beth Anne. I use she, they pronouns. I am a bunch of different things, but I'm trying to finish my PhD in theology right now. And I also, yeah, I do a bunch of things, but I guess that's most important in terms of here in our conversation today is that I am increasingly finding the arts to be a part of my, I want to say, spiritual practices. And in particular, I realized maybe last year or so that doing collage has become a spiritual practice for me, a way to be present to myself and be attentive to myself, and to invite God to be a part of that in a really gentle way. And so, yeah, my submission or my what was published in the journal is a series of 4 collages. The first 2 collages, which are called Cradling It All and A Curious Castle, I made those 2 at the same time, or kind of back to back on the same weekend. I was on a spiritual retreat, and my spiritual director we were talking about kind of this being at this juncture of like holding my past and then also looking forward, and what it meant to kind of allow my attention and my energy and my heart to move from the grief I was holding to what might be ahead of me. And so as we had talked about that, I just had this real desire to make a collage out of both of those things. So cradling it all, kind of darker colors, some black and white images that for me really represented some of how I was feeling about what I had been through in the kind of 2 or 3 years before this time. And then the Curious Castle. In contrast, a lot of really bright colors. And this ended up being kind of, for me, an image of my inner landscape. I really love Teresa of Avila's idea of an interior castle. And so that was kind of what I was holding as I was doing this, was thinking about what does my interior castle look like? And for me, it ended up being more of a landscape of not just a single building, but this kind of layers of a landscape. And so, yeah, there's a lot of curiosity built into that one. And then the next two images, the next one, these two images I did at different times, and they weren't ones that I came to the collage with a particular kind of goal or aim in mind. It was more a sense of what I was drawn to, and not even really knowing what it was that I was trying to put on the paper, but yeah, but kind of just sitting with it and pulling things together. And so this one, I'm not even here. If you had asked me at the time what it was about, I would have said that there was something to do with kind of femininity or like femaleness in it, but I didn't really have much beyond that. But when I went back to this, as I was pulling it together for the journal, I looked at this image and I immediately went, oh, I was processing my first miscarriage and what that meant, and all these ideas and how that touches on gender and relationship and family, but especially kind of identity as someone who has been socialized and is in many ways a woman. And then the last one, I was off work and I was in a really, things were really heavy, but I knew I was going to be okay. I knew I was going to be okay. I knew it wouldn't last forever. And I was trying to practice rest in a way that I eliminated as many obligations as I could. And I let myself be drawn to whatever it was that kind of sparked interest or sparked energy for me, because I didn't have a lot of energy. And so this came together over probably a week or two of just kind of, yeah, again, looking at images and then spending the time. As you can see, some of these are really delicate to cut out. Those long, skinny mushrooms are really tricky. And so the kind of the gentleness and the care and the attention to the details of this coming together. And then as I was kind of putting it together, it was just a scrap of a magazine that I had cut out for something else. But in the scrap, I just saw this phrase, I suppose I was depressed that day. And it just struck me as exactly what was kind of happening for me. And so, yeah, it became this kind of acceptance of my depression, but at the same time, there was this kind of lightness to it of like, yeah, I suppose I am depressed this day, but I also, there was this temporal space to it, and this sense of that not being the only thing that defined me, even though it was really dominant. So yeah, that's me, and those are my collages for this.
Thank you so much for sharing, and well, looking forward to talking more about the
Mhm.
process. And now, can you introduce yourself and your piece for the journal?
Hi, I'm Laura Sargent, and I worked for about 30 years as a clinical social worker. My specialty was child and youth mental health. And I worked in a hospital setting, so there were often a lot of diagnostics, as part of access to care, but also we were a tertiary care hospital. Well, still are, but I've retired. And so the young people we saw might have outstripped the needs in their local communities. And I came to social work late. I spent my 20s working on being a musician and realized I needed a day job to pay the rent. Um, and what I loved about social work, and I retain that identity, is it recognizes intersectionality, and always looks at an individual sort of in the context of, you know, their own humanness, but also who they are in their family, who the family is in the community, and what pressures or limitations or lacks, you know, or oppressions, you know, does someone face. Um, and I grew up in a multidisciplinary family in a way. My father was a clergyman, as my mom said. Um, he studied at McMaster Divinity School, worked for 3 years as a youth pastor, and then decided the piece that appealed to him was psychology and kind of working with kids. He ended up working as a math teacher to kind of pay the bills while he was thinking about school, and fell in love with the teaching. So he was sort of a teacher and a clergyman. My mom was a nurse. And then this piece is about one of my two living brothers. And one brother is a physician and still living. And of course, I was a social worker. And then Matt, the youngest brother, um, and this is in some ways what the piece wrestles with, is what do you say about a sibling with a disability when someone says, you know, oh, what does Matt do? And I think I always struggled with some shame, with not being able to say something conventional. Um, and so Matt was a human being, and he loved music and loved his church, and, you know, was married and had a rich life, and also had myotonic dystrophy, which um, impacted him both in terms of mental health, physical health, um, and in some ways, like, would have been on the spectrum, but was never diagnosed. But I think was neuroatypical. Um, and so this piece it was focused like the idea of almost a lens on a single moment where, as my mom's health failed, um, I began to take more of the responsibility and attended his specialist appointments with him. And we were very fortunate that a neuro sort of developmental neuro degenerative disease clinic was in our hometown. So Matt went once a year and really loved seeing this physician. And in a particular meeting, the physician was really kind of discouraging. And there's sort of, I think that the piece was written out of one single moment, like sitting with Matt, waiting for this fellow to come back. And that also transition of kind of becoming Matt's mom in that moment, and that handoff had occurred, and would be for the next, 10 years of his life.
Well, thank
And
you
I think,
both. Oh,
yeah,
sorry, Laura.
I was just going to say, and I think that then the other is just what I'm spending my time on these days is writing.
Beautiful. It must be so nice to have some time to do some writing.
The luxuries. I
Lovely,
realize
lovely.
I'm speaking from a point of privilege when it comes to free time.
Oh yeah. Yes, that's amazing. I hope we will all be able to do that too at some point. I sort of shove my writing into like little pockets when I can get to it.
And reading for pleasure.
Oh yeah, that's another really important one. Yeah. All right, so I think what we'll do now is we'll talk to Beth Ann a little bit about her pieces. We had sent you some questions in advance, so
Mhm.
hopefully they resonated with you. I think we sort of kind of already talked about the first one that we sent you in your introduction, Beth Ann. So we'll go to the second one. You describe creating a home for emotions through collage, through doing collage.
Mhm.
How do you see art as an act of care, both for yourself and others?
Yeah, I think so. I think often, we've already named how much time is a luxury in some ways, and so I think we often don't give time to our inner worlds. And for me, I was just said yesterday to my therapist, I often don't know what to do. I'm feeling a feeling and I don't know what to do with it. And so for me, collage gives me something to do when I'm feeling, or and also the time to feel the feelings. And then also there has to be such a gentleness to it once I am kind of assembling pieces, or once I want to say in the first stages of collage, I can tear a whole page out of a magazine, or take out a piece of paper and say, okay, I'm going to use this in some way. But then as I get further into the process, there's such an attention to detail that has to happen. And like I said, these pieces can become so fragile. And so I think in being gentle with, and being careful, and being patient and precise with these little pieces of paper, in many ways it is being all of those things to the emotions that are tied to what is happening. And so I think for me it's an act of care that I'm allowing my emotions to have an expression. I'm giving them time and space to even evolve. I might start a collage with, 15, 20 pieces in front of me, and maybe 10 of them end up in the collage and I find five others. But I think there's this process that is very similar to how emotions get settled, of starting with kind of a vague sense of something and not knowing exactly where it needs to go or what it is. And yeah, and providing space for that to unfold. And then I think it's an act of care for others in the sharing of the collages, because I think there's something that people can connect with. And whether it is connecting with it and seeing themselves in the image in some way, or being drawn to the image, or even being able to see in it something that maybe I find difficult to articulate in words, but I can, through an image, communicate something of those more difficult emotions. Yeah. So I think it is, and this touches a bit on the first question that we skipped over, but I spoke a bit about, but the question about this being different from writing or other forms. And I do love to write. For me, again, I would say that the two primary ways I kind of like create space for and put my inner world on the outside of me is collage and poetry. And so I do love words, and also there are times that I don't have the right words, or I need to even find a way to get to a place where words are possible, or the words feel too vulnerable. Some of the things that are in these collages, I could tell you very specifically about what some of them are, and also I don't have to. That there's a sense in which the collage communicates something without me having to reveal the parts that feel the most vulnerable, if that makes sense. And so it feels like an act of care for myself in the safety that it provides, and also provides something different than the written word does for me.
Yeah, that that make a lot of sense to me. As you were talking about holding through and letting emotions settle and deciding what pieces are needed in that collage, I wondered if there was also a settling happening within you. Not that all emotions can also be settled.
Mhm.
I wondered about that.
Yeah, I think that's why, like, calling this the overall thing, this idea of collaging myself a home, is that there is a settling for me in that process. And that when I kind of get to this point of feeling like, okay, this collage is complete, there's a sense of pride and a sense of excitement of what I've created. And then as I look at it and have this sense of congruence between something in me that was trying to be expressed and what I've put together, it feels like a relief in some ways. There's that sigh of like, yeah, this is it. This is in some way accurate, which is strange to say because it, what is it's accurate to what? Or like you see some of my images, some of them are more abstract, and yet there is for me this sense of yeah, something has settled in the process, and something also this act of externalizing something is not about trying to get rid of my feelings, but like I said, making a home for them. Like when I'm not sure where they belong or what to do with them. And often again, I don't want to lose the connection to these tender moments.
Mm.
And I mean, 3 of the 4 collages that I have here are grief related. And I don't want to lose the connection to those moments and to those experiences. And I also know that sometimes it's too heavy to carry. And so feeling like it belongs there, I can access those images. I can access the collage when perhaps the memories are too much, but I can know that I have this connection. I have made something tangible that represents that experience, or that dilemma or whatever it is. And so they act as these kind of like anchor points that really do, for me, again, let me kind of settle into what it is that I'm putting into the images.
Yeah, thank you, Beth Anne. We wanted to talk listen to you talk about your piece, I'm Not Even Here,
Mm-hmm.
and how you reflect on absence and womanhood and this idea of fruitfulness. So, how do you see this work fitting in with conversation about cultural, theological ideas about gender and embodiment?
I love this question because it makes me want to cry. And I think this is where there is something about this topic that is very current and present that I'm still working through. Um, I've had 3 miscarriages in the last year and a half, and I'm 40. And so when it comes to biological children, I'm quite realistically grappling with that not being a part of my life. And I've wanted to be a mother since I was old enough to play with dolls. And I know that some of that is bound up in cultural expectations, and also I was raised in a fairly conservative evangelical context. And so ideas of womanhood and motherhood are so entwined with each other. And so that was something that I was immersed in from the time I was very young. And even as my own ideas about gender have shifted, and I mean, I said at the top I use she, they pronouns. I think I realized probably about 8 years ago now, I was having a conversation with a loved one and talking about this recognition that I always felt like I couldn't get womanhood right, or like even when I was younger, I wasn't the right kind of girl. I was too loud. I had too many opinions. I was socially awkward. I didn't have the cool clothes, all of these things. And then finally getting to this point of saying, what if I actually don't have to aim for that as a goal? Like, what if that's not a moral requirement that I perform womanhood in this way that I have up until then, my early 30s, had felt this pressure to be aiming for. And so that for me was this such a freedom to release this box of gender and the cultural and religious norms of gender. And it felt like such a relief. At the same time, I knew at that time that I might not be able to have biological children. I've had irregular periods and whatnot my whole life, which again, even just saying that in this space, even though all of us are people with uteruses, I feel this anxiety of like, you're not allowed to talk about that, you know, which is part of all of this. Anyways, so I still had this desire, and I still, kind of hoped for that. So I think like what is in this collage that I see now that I didn't fully see at the time that I was making it is this question of like, where do I belong? And so in the center of it, where there's this cutout that's obviously a femme shape, but all it is um, abstract splashes of color, and this sense of I'm here, but I'm not here. And where do I look for those norms and those narratives and those images that um, that validate me? And I mean that in a real sense of I'm I'm not interested in not being a woman. And this is not saying that that isn't the case for others, but I've thought about this a lot for myself. I very much relate to being a woman, and also I don't know where that is. And I think that as I embrace this complexification of gender, there was still this, I don't even know if I've said it out loud before, this thought that like, if I'm a mother, that still roots me, that still gives me an anchor in womanhood, um, in a very specific way. And if I don't have either of those, where do I fit? And what are the ideals or the values or the sense of goodness as this kind of, where do they come from? And there's many ways to be fruitful or to be productive in our lives. And I also think, like, again, the Christian narratives around fruitfulness and what that means around biological reproduction are so entwined. And this uh, love of family, which I have no problems with. I love family too. But what does that mean for those of us for whom the conventional and assumed ways of being are not in reach, for whatever reason that might be? And what does it mean for me to be fruitful? And how do I relate to the next generation, specifically of women? In the collage, I have this kind of younger girl reaching towards this space, and I'm not sure if that's my younger self or if that's the next generation reaching, and what is it that I'm offering, or what is it that I'm and it's not that it's just about contributing, but who am I relative to this next generation? um Yeah, I've said a lot. I'll pause and see if you want to add anything or ask anything, or if that's an answer in itself.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. I didn't know. I know for our listeners, Beth Ann and I started the PhD program together, have known each other. I think we've known each other for 8 years now.
Yeah, 2017 is when we met.
Yeah. So I
Yeah,
didn't and I just my heart was breaking when you were talking about the miscarriages. So thank you so much for sharing that. And
thank you.
I'm sure there will be a lot of listeners who will be able to relate to that. So we really appreciate um you sharing that part of your story with everyone.
Thanks. I think again, it's something that I'm learning more and more. The number of women who are people who are trying to have biological children, the percentage of them who have have miscarriages is way higher than we realize. And yeah, a lot of people don't know how to talk about it. And if I can say, even one of my miscarriages, which I'm intentionally calling a miscarriage, happened early enough that the doctor said it didn't qualify as like pregnancy loss. But I said, but knew that I was pregnant, and my body knew that I was pregnant, and I knew that that was happening, and yet it happened early enough that in the medical field, it's not considered a miscarriage. It's not considered a pregnancy loss. So not only did I experience the loss, but I've been told that I didn't actually have a loss, even though they knew that it had happened. Laura, did you want to jump in and say
Well,
something?
just, I mean, and what that leads to is what we call disenfranchised grief,
Yeah.
you know?
Do you want to say more about what that is for the
It would
listeners
just
who might
the
not know?
idea that it's a grief that's not recognized kind of communally. So it
Mhm.
becomes sort of invisible. It becomes hard to speak of. And it
And
doesn't have a home.
yeah, and it's interesting because when you say that, again, two of these other collages are about different forms of disenfranchised grief. Actually, also related though, again, to family and parenting and motherhood. I've also been a foster parent, and in the first collage, cradling it all, there's a tiny, almost hidden face of a baby, and I had been a foster parent for over a year, and uh, my my partner at the time had a major mental health crisis, and in the midst of this mental health crisis, this little one who had only known our care, well, almost, they were 4.5 months old when they came into our care, was taken out of my care without notice, and I have not seen them since, and I have had no contact with them since. And that's another form of this disenfranchised grief, where this was not my child. I knew that they were not permanently my child. And yet, the way that that happened is exactly what you've said, this form of denial that that is a grief, or denial that I have had a right to grief. So, yeah, so that's very much real. And I think many of us have those forms of disenfranchised grief in different ways. And when we can't put words to it, or we don't even know if we have permission to put words to it, I think that's where, again, for me, images can be, yeah.
And the other thing, it's certainly relatable for me as well is, I'm sort of child free, but not by choice in a way, just sort of by circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
That's another, for sure, kind of quiet identity loss where you sit beside traditional women and womanhood as it's
Mm-hmm.
defined. And how do you even participate in a conversation at work when people are comparing milestones? I
Mm-hmm.
would lean on the intel, as close to a niece and nephews. But it's like you need to borrow children
Yeah.
um, to engage. And I have another friend who's experienced, pregnancy loss before. She did have children. And again, it's like, I'm not ready to show up to your baby shower. And people not being able to kind of understand or sort of support that.
Yeah, thank you. That's so real. And I think along with that, so the other piece for me is, having been a foster parent, I sometimes talk as a parent, or I sometimes like those milestones, and then I realize, oh, if I explain my intimate knowledge of teething or of learning to walk, then I have to explain the whole backstory, and then it becomes something that feels so complicated. Or even sometimes I will talk in ways that people will say, oh, do you have kids? Or like, oh, you must be a mom. And then it's like, no, question mark, or no asterisk. And so it becomes so complicated. And then maybe I don't want to get into the grief of it all. Maybe I just want to be able to say that I'm familiar with that. But it's something that is then has so many layers. Yeah.
I think Laura and Beth Anne, such a powerful, powerful conversation that doesn't happen enough in church or in wider society. So, we'll move to Laura for now and talk a bit about your work. And the first question is around the tension between love and responsibility and grief in sibling relationship. And
Mhm.
yeah, I'm curious from an able-bodied sibling, what you wish more people understood about being the sibling of someone with a disability.
Well, I think there's such fierce loyalty, and it's the only family experience you know. So, and there, for me, there was, like almost 7 year age gap, and Matt was younger. So there was almost like a natural order to things that maybe needed extra care when he was little, like just it was maybe harder for him to have naps but in ways, as I describe in the piece, we'd actually thought he was a bit of a genius. He kind of outstretched some milestones. Anyway, I guess all that to say is that I think every SIB experience would be quite unique depending on how and what the sibling is struggling with. So it could be an invisible kind of disability, like explosive behavior and for me with Matt, with that age gap, I think there was more intimate awareness that he was struggling if I had friends over, and then there'd be certain rules, or you got to be quiet, or like I did have one friend sort of say, "Oh, I remember we used to always have to be quiet because Matt was asleep." Although my mom would argue that it was like "Oh yeah, we were really chill. We didn't tiptoe around anyway." Um, and it sort of hit in some ways in adulthood for me, where more of his challenges, like because it was progressive, so the physical challenges became more apparent into his 20s and 30s and beyond. I think what we were dealing with when he was younger were more learning disabilities as diagnosed, and with a field, because this was the 1970s, so my parents were strong advocates and did at least get learning disabled. And that was value added because they could advocate at school, and it did help him find some peer groups. And I think they were part of forming an association for children with learning disabilities, so that he had a little friendship group. Um, but for me as a sibling, I think it's more through teenagehood and adulthood, and you're realizing your sib isn't hitting all the same milestones, and people, just like, do you have kids? They're asking these questions like, what's Matt do? And that's where it's like, oh, I don't know what to say. Um, and it took time for me to recognize that I'm measuring Matt against me. Like it's like that othering experience, that I'm placing myself in the center of a point of comparison, um, versus Matt as Matt. And it takes time and confidence to be able to lean into that. But I mean, the other is that I Sibs are watching. Like I'm evaluating all my friends by their behavior. And it's like, are you kind to Matt or not? And it was like an easy sorting procedure in terms of who the good eggs are in your life. And you're always so grateful that you go to a family party that, like, I'd have one eye out and it's like, oh, lovely, Dave's talking to Matt. Like that the people who would lean in and not turn their back on, whether it's like missing social cues or some gaps in hygiene or things that made it maybe less easy to chat with Matt, perseverative around topics. Um, so there's certainly that gratitude. And then I think I just heard on a podcast the other night, I think they identify there's 1 billion people with disabilities around the world. So does that make it then 1 in 7 or 1 in 8? Like I don't know the global population offhand. So it could be that in every 2 families, you don't know what someone in their SIBs. And then of course there's the heartache for I think for parents who would want, you know, a good path for their young person. So we were certainly socialized to be Matt's people. Um, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That wasn't uh I have very few siblings too, so
Mhm.
yeah, that's a good description. So we're doing me now.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. When I was listening to you talk, I was thinking that you sound like you were a really good sister. Really good sister. So sounds like Matt was really blessed by having you in his life.
Thank you.
Um, I think in the interest of time, we might go forward. We might skip question 2 and go to question 3 that we had given you. So this one is about your storytelling is deeply visual, often centering around photographs and memory. How do you see memory shaping the way we relate to disability, family, and even ourselves?
Yeah, this is an amazing question. And I think I had, a handful of thoughts. One is that I think, if we look at how our minds operate, and in some ways that's what the piece was trying to capture, is that we don't think in a linear way, and I don't really feel like within me time is linear. Like I feel like it's more spiral, or that experiences are stacked, but there's that we can always access a younger version of ourselves at any moment, like it's just there below the surface. So some of that imagery was taken from photographs, that, my mom was great for candid shots of us. Which is lovely because it captures, an aspect of you that's very different than standing in a row. Um, and so these memories of Matt, like listening to the turntable or like filling the bowl with raspberries, then the rest of the context, comes back that he ate more before he even got into the house and there was none to put on his cereal. Um, and so that Matt remains right beside the adult Matt, who has more challenges than he did when he was young. And those Matts are still there now that he's gone. Um, and I think the other is that depending on the sequence, like how we want to structure our memory in a way, or how we recall things, then we do try to write that story. Like we try to kind of, we make sense of our lives through story. And that would change dramatically, kind of depending on. So, in some ways, this story, I was sequencing this sense that, wow, he can use a turntable, like he made porridge for himself when he was 3, like he did all these phenomenal things. And then there's this sort of shock, like he failed, like he came home with a report card that said Matt failed scissors, like so what kind of messages is he getting, from this young age? How does that feel as a family? It's like, whoa, what's going on? And then he's having these experiences of kids whipping a bike down the ravine, like bullying that somehow Miles and I like could shrug off, stuck to him a bit, So it's just a different path. And of course, we're comparing our own paths through childhood, all of us, to Matt's, experience. Um, so we can call that an arc of, tragedy, but it's like, what are we measuring it against? Because it wasn't necessarily tragic, it was more unexpected. And that in ways too, I think he was dealt a really tough hand, like no question about it. And that's part of what the piece grapples with, being the sib who just won a coin toss, like it was really arbitrary. Um, yeah, I just guess that's some of the thoughts on memory.
Thank you, Noah. Yeah. And in writing this piece, you mentioned that it changed how you showed up for Matt. So we wanted to have you talk about that and have you share about how you saw writing as this tool to understand your relationship and understand Matt.
Um, yeah, your questions are also rich and thought-provoking. My process often is to do what I would call like a free write. So it's not really, I'm not aiming at anything. It's very kind of unconscious. Um, or at least I'm trying to tap into the unconscious by just kind of writing without stopping. And and I think at one point, then I'll go back through all, sometimes it's like an iceberg and it's just I've just thrown piles of snow at something. And then later I kind of chip away and see, oh, here's blue snow and red snow and and I separate things. So I did have a document, with things thematically related to Matt that then I can pull some of the imagery from. But for me, this piece kind of was exploring the places where I felt I failed Matt, where it's like it's easier, to hang out with the sib who's more similar to me by age and interests, So I think a lot of the challenge for me with Matt was around like the more concrete language and, like even interest in shows, it might be like action things, which I understand even better now. I mean, if I wish for anything, it would be that we understood autism and that I had that lens from a much younger age. It was more through my work life that in my own head, it's like, oh, um, and like I would say, I liked things with more subtext or, so we had very different interests. Um, and so it was sort of writing into the shame of that and arriving at a place of forgiveness, that there are ways that I was maybe doing my best. Um, and just this realization or like examination of to what extent I guess, am I wanting Matt to be more like me? And some of that might be, and I wouldn't at all judge my parents. Like I think it was helpful. They did push him, and he ended up, with a post-secondary, certificate. He went to the Harris Institute of the Arts and, um, was in this social group and he was keen to be independent. He always lived, outside the family home, as an adult. And um, but I think there were times maybe where after my dad died, so from age 25 onward, my mom was really a single parent for Matt. And we also saw the writing on the wall because it was the same illness and my dad had died at 60. So how long, will Matt have? And it was almost like, can we take the foot off the brake? Like because one of the things we learned about the illness is apathy is one of the cardinal experiences. So your house is going to be messy. You know, you might not have more ambition than wanting to kind of watch shows or listen to all the Beatle albums in sequence. And so it was, you know, valuable to be able to, um, especially after my mom died, to not feel like I needed to carry her intense torch that he kind of do his physio 3 times a week. And it's like, he's just not motivated. Like, and there may be more quality of life for him to just be in his apartment ordering pizza. Like, if one day his heart explodes, like, you know, he did what he wanted. Um, and there were, you know, I think many things, like my brother is a physician, works, you know, with homeless medicine and in chronic continuing care. So that was like this other blessing where he helped Matt land in the housing that he had. Um, but often, like, and both of us could see, if it weren't for family, and not that we're heroic, but it was more like we had the ability to care for Matt in a way. He would have been homeless for sure, because he, you know, he didn't read things well. And back to that question we're not touching on, but this idea of within hospital systems, you know, he absolutely needed an advocate. And it's interesting, in England, they have a specialty in medicine that is like learning disabled. And um, so that, and they were saying there can be disproportionate experiences of, you know, aspiration pneumonias and different things that can happen within a learning disabled population that I think without the plain language, without subtext, you know, people would likely be untreated or undertreated. And Matt tended to underreport, you know. So if you asked him something concrete, like, have you fallen? He might be thinking about the last 2 days. It's like, nope, no, I'm all good. But I know, like, broadly, he's talked to me over the year, like, you know, he's fallen 12 times or something. Um, so yeah. Anyway, like I felt really, really lucky that in his last year of life, I was retired. I had the time, and I'd spent, like, I actually knew how to treat OCD. You know, I knew how to kind of do the autism whispering. Like, I love that population. And it's kind of this reciprocity where I think Matt taught me to be empathic in a way, um, you know, for others, for difference, to realize that life isn't easy for everybody. Um, and I do believe they still think statistically there are more, like a slight representation of um, SIBs of disabled folks being in caregiving professions. Um, Probably because you're attuned from a young age, or you can see the importance of a kind professional.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. I totally resonate with what you just said about um how we end up in caring professions. That's and how our family of origin can influence where we end up in life. So thank you for
Mhm.
that. And thank you so much for sharing about Matt's life. Um
Thanks for giving the piece a home. You know,
yeah,
a little while to land.
yeah. We're very lucky to have it. Um, so to end up today, what we usually do is we ask you both if you have a question for each other. So if there's anything that's percolated or come up, bubbled up for you. So Beth Ann, I wonder, do you have any questions you might want to ask Laura? Or any thoughts you want to share?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, thank you. I think that there's two thoughts, or maybe a thought and a question that are connected. One is, as I was listening to you talk about the fierceness of your loyalty to Matt and the attention that you give to how people treat him, I think that is something I also have felt, even in some ways with fostering. So I had this little wee one, and then later on, I had a teenager who, I mean, people are much quicker to show up in ways for babies than they are for teenagers. And I paid a lot of attention that, and and my not my teenager, I called her, she had some disabilities, and I was very aware of how people engaged with her or didn't engage with her. And I think there's something really important there about when we have these bonds, when there's someone that we love who is, whether biologically or kind of adopted into our family, that we're so attentive to how the world treats them and how people in our own circles treat them and what that means for how we view other people. Anyways, I'm kind of sitting with that and thinking about that as not in a judgmental way, but just a recognition of how powerful those bonds can be, and what that means. Yeah, what that means for both people in that relationship. Because I'm sure Matt was aware of that fierceness, and I know my teenager, she knew that I showed up for her in a way that very few other people in her life did, and that meant something really significant to her. And then kind of connected to that is, I think, this question of shame and the complexity of shame in caregiving and the ways that we can't make other people's lives easier. And maybe the importance of like, how do we name that, or when and where do we name that in ways that are helpful, or when do we have to hold that and not put that back on someone else? Because it's not Matt's fault, right? Or but also, how do we work through our shame in the context of these relationships, in a way that's honest and honoring. I don't know if you have an answer ready to go, but it's certainly something that I'm thinking about as you spoke and as I read your piece.
Yeah, and I think it's, Christ's question sort of it's like, how do we serve the other, like the meek, the one that's not easy to care for? That's who we need to turn to and
Mhm.
turn to first. Or and people might say things like, well, I don't like going into hospitals. They make me or I don't want to visit someone in a nursing home. But it's like, it's not about you, and that's maybe the gift, is that appreciation of the shadow side of life and the dark moments, and what someone else needs.
Mhm.
And so that's where I was challenging myself, to be more or recognizing these gaps where I wasn't inviting Matt over the way I might Miles, and maybe I could tell myself, well, it's hard for him to get, yeah.
Mhm.
And I think, Beth Ann, for you, like, what I appreciated when you said, that sometimes you can use imagery above because you can't find the words. And I was
Mhm.
thinking, yeah, and that's kind of like I'm doing the reverse. Like, I have an image and I'm trying to, and it takes 1,000 words.
Mhm.
And the image of the peach and the fruit, and fruitfulness, definitely was one that resonated with me. And I guess my question would be, do you start with a single image first, or, do you have stacks of, like, in terms of process?
Yeah, at this point, I have like a small stack of images I've pulled out that draw me in or I appeal to me, but I don't know where they're gonna fit. But I
Right.
have some kind of a small folder. But I think often I'll start, if I'm starting like fully blank slate, I will always start by going through what I've already either like partially cut out or pulled out of magazines, and start with what I already have and see what pulls, like what, if something pulls from to me from there. And then once I have a couple of pieces, then I usually, I don't know, then I kind of will look through. And again, I have at this point so many magazines and art books. Like, I will go to thrift stores and pick up books of, I recently
Cool.
picked up one of that was like Picasso's art, and it's like from the 70s. So there's like only 4 color pages in it, but I also paid $2 for it. and I love using both black and white and color. So there's that, or different magazines, and kind of if someone so if someone's thinking of collaging, or if you're thinking of collaging, it's like, well, whatever kind of magazines or materials you're drawn to, start with those, and then yeah, I think that for me there's often a sense of like things, once I have one or two things, then it's looking for other pieces that fit. And yeah, I think like you were saying, in some ways, it's similar to that sort of writing without stop. There's like it's very much an intuitive thing. I'm not, it's very much led by feeling, in that same way for me. And then of course there's like the layers of then coming back to it, and piecing it together, or giving it time. But the beginning is very much just intuitive, intuitive, if you will. Yeah.
Thank you both very much for sharing such profound and vulnerable experiences in many ways. So we are grateful for your book in the journal and for the conversation here, and we know others will be. So thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy and Miriam, for having us. And
Yes.
yeah, Laura, thank you for listening and sharing and the dialogue. It's always a delight to be in this space.
Yes, it was lovely. Thank you so much for including me.